The pry bar bit deep into the weathered plank, and the wood split loose with a dry crack that echoed across the empty pasture. Behind the broken siding where packed dirt should have sealed the hillside, a narrow shaft of morning light fell across an iron door handle, rusted the color of dried blood. Danielle Mercer stepped back from the smokehouse wall, 46 years of knowing this ground unraveling in a single breath. 200 yards down the drive, a polished dark blue Buick was already rolling toward her farmhouse, its tires clean from the county highway. Inside that car sat the man who held the balloon payment coming due in 90 days on 96 acres her family had worked since before the Depression. He did not yet know about the door. She did not yet know that whatever waited on the other side of it had been braced shut from the inside on purpose, by hands that had gone still 40 years before she was born. She reached for the handle anyway. The pry bar caught in Danielle Mercer's palm as she wedged it behind the board, and the wood cracked loose all at once, tearing away in a long, splintered strip that sent a slice of pale morning light cutting through the gap into the dark behind it. She stopped where she stood. The hammer in her other hand hung loose at her side, forgotten. She leaned in toward the opening, letting her eyes adjust to the shadow past the broken plank, and what she saw made no sense at all. It was not packed dirt behind that wall the way it should have been in a building set into the sloping edge of a hillside. It was empty space, a pocket of black air that had no business being there. Danny reached back for the flashlight clipped to her belt loop, thumbed it on, and passed the beam through the gap. An iron door handle stared back at her out of the dark, rusted the color of dried blood, bolted into a slab of oak she could just barely make out beyond the reach of her light. She stepped back from the wall. Her boots crunched on the gravel and sawdust mix that had built up at the base of the smokehouse over the years, and she stood there in the March cold, with her breath coming visible in short pulls, staring at a building she had known her entire life. A building she had played beside as a child, walked past 10,000 times as an adult, taken for granted the way a person takes for granted a fence post or a length of pasture wire. Behind her, Sam Prescott, who farmed the acreage across the creek and had wandered over to see how the T-Roam was going, walked up slow and looked at the gap in the boards. His shoulders shifted under his canvas coat. His eyes narrowed the way a man's eyes do when he sees something that does not fit the picture he expected. Was that always there? Danny's throat worked once before she answered. I don't know. She did not say anything else for a long moment. She just stood there, her free hand pressed flat against the cold stone at the base of the smokehouse wall, feeling the grit of 90 years of Missouri weather in the mortar beneath her palm, realizing that she did not know this building at all. Sam did not press her. He was not that kind of man. He gave a small tip of the head toward the house up the yard, the way of saying he would be around if she needed help, and he walked back toward the fence line the way he had come. Danny stayed where she was for a long time after his truck rolled out of the drive. She was 46 years old that spring of 1987, back on the 96 acres in the Missouri Ozarks, where she had grown up trying to hold together a farm her father had left in worse shape than either of them had ever said out loud. He had gone quick the previous September, a heart that had been giving him warnings for years, finally deciding on a Tuesday afternoon while he was fixing the pump at the stock tank. She had been on the shop floor in Rolla when the call came through, still holding a torque wrench, and the plant manager had walked her out to the parking lot and stood beside her while she cried without shame in front of him for the first and last time in her working life. The cattle barn sagged on its northeast corner, the beam under it split clean through and shimmied with a chunk of oak her father had put there as a temporary fix at least 6 years back. The fence needed rebuilding in half a dozen places along the west pasture, the wire so old in one stretch that Danny could snap it between her fingers if she wanted to. The grain bin leaked when the rain came in hard from the south. The cropland had not been worked right in years since her mother passed and her father lost the heart for it, and the note at the bank was not getting any friendlier. The paper on her father's desk when she had finally sat down to sort through it in October had left her with a knot in her stomach she still had not managed to swallow all the way down. $47,000. That was the figure. 90 days now until the balloon payment came due on a loan her father had taken out 3 years earlier to keep the operation running through a bad calving season, and Danny had inherited it along with the land and the trucks and the boxes of receipts and the smell of her father's pipe tobacco still faint in the curtains of the front room. She was not a farmer by trade, not the way her father had been. She had spent the last 22 years turning wrenches and grinding parts at a machine shop over in Rolla, working her way up from the sweeping floors job she had taken at 17 to a place on the fabrication line where she made better money than most of the men who had started the same year she did. She had known engines and lathes and hydraulic presses. She had known the smell of cutting oil and the weight of a good hammer and the particular satisfaction of a piece coming off the mill with intolerance on the first pass. She had not known drought cycles or soil chemistry or the price of feeder cattle in October. She had come home on weekends the last few years to help her father as he slowed down, and the drive up Highway 63 in the dark on Sunday nights had gotten longer every trip. When the funeral was over and the will read, and the extent of the debt made plain going back to Rolla, and pretending she could keep the farm going from 90 miles away, had stopped being a plan and started being a fantasy. She had given her notice at the shop the second week in October. The foreman had shaken her hand and told her the door would be open if she ever came back. Both of them had known she probably would not. Selling the place outright had crossed her mind more than once that first winter. There was a real estate man out of Springfield who had called twice already, his voice too smooth, his numbers too low, quoting her figures that would have covered the banknote and left maybe $8,000 for her to start over somewhere with. But something about walking away from 96 acres her family had held since before the Depression did not sit right with her, even with the note hanging over every decision she made. Her grandfather had worked this ground with mules before there were tractors on it. Her father had been born in the front bedroom of the farmhouse. Her mother was buried in the little cemetery up on the ridge where the Mercer plot took up the northwest corner under 2 black walnut trees. So she stayed. She did what she could with what little money the place still generated, patching one thing at a time and putting off the rest, running a small herd of 40 head that her father had reduced from 100 over the last 5 years of his life. She got up before daylight most mornings and worked until she could not see her hands anymore. And some nights she fell asleep in her father's old recliner, still wearing her barn coat because she did not have the energy left to hang it up. At the back of the yard, tucked into the slope where the ground rose toward the woodlot, sat the old stone and timber smokehouse her grandfather Elias Mercer had built sometime around 1930. It had been standing empty and unused for longer than Danny could remember. The roof leaned to the east. The siding had gone soft with rot in a couple of the lower boards. The door hung crooked on one broken hinge held shut mostly by habit. Inside, when she had finally worked up the nerve to look a week earlier, she had found old iron meat hooks still hanging from the rafters, a few warped wooden shelves along the near wall, a cracked smoke pit against the back where the fire had once burned low and slow for days on end. Everything exactly as useless as it looked. She needed lumber and stone more than she needed an old building nobody had used in decades. The stone alone would save her a trip to the quarry for the barn corner that needed shoring up before the next hard freeze pushed it any further out of true. The old timber, rough as it was, still had life left in it for fence repair along the south line. Tearing the smokehouse down for salvage seemed like the only sensible thing to do with it. It was a decision that made perfect sense on paper. It was a decision that would open the door on everything else. She had started the Tyrone 3 days ago. The south wall had come apart clean, the boards, releasing from their nails with the tired sigh of old wood, letting go of what it had been holding for too long. The stone at the base of that wall had lifted out in usable chunks she had stacked on the pallet beside the wheelbarrow, ready to be hauled up to the barn corner as soon as she had time to mix the mortar. The east wall had been harder. The corner posts had been sunk deeper than she expected, the way a man builds when he is planning to still be around in 50 years to see how his work has held up. She had come out this morning meaning to start on the north wall, the wall built into the slope, the one that should have been solid earth behind it, the one that was not. Danny stayed at the smokehouse until the sun had climbed high enough to warm the air a few degrees. She did not pull any more boards. She just stood there and looked. She walked the length of the north wall from one end to the other, measuring it with her eyes, comparing it in her mind against what she remembered of the interior. A smokehouse of that size did not need more than a single course of stone and timber along the back. This section looked like something had been built up from the inside, added onto after the fact, rather than raised all at once the way the rest of the structure had been. She crouched down and studied the mortar between the lower stones. Where the outer face of the wall showed through in the places she had already pulled the siding, she could see a second layer of mortar underneath the first, a slightly different color from the joint work above it. Grayer, coarser, older maybe. She could not tell yet. She would have to chip some of it away to be sure. She moved along and looked at the stones themselves. The ones her grandfather had used across the rest of the building were pulled from the same limestone bed that ran along the creek at the north end of the property. All of them roughly the same size and color, the way a man builds when he is doing the whole job at one go. The stones in this section were mismatched. Some of them were the creek limestone. Others were darker, denser, the kind of rock a man had to haul from farther off. Worked in among the original ones without any obvious pattern, the way a man works when he is patching something after the fact and using whatever he can get his hands on. She looked at the nails in the boards she had already pulled loose and stacked to the side. Most of them had come out the way nails come out of a wall built to be seen. Heads showing on the outside, points sunk in from the front, but a couple of them, the ones she had pulled from the section right around where the flashlight beam had found the door handle, had been driven in backward. Heads buried in this wood on the inside. Points showing on the outside where nobody would look twice. Under a warped board she had nearly tossed aside, without a second look, she found the hinge. Half hidden in the shadow of the door frame, rusted into place. The kind of forged iron a man made himself at a farm forge, instead of buying at a store, and the sight of it stopped her cold. Somebody had gone to real trouble once to make sure this part of the wall did not look like anything worth a second glance. Somebody had picked mismatched stone and reversed nails and hidden the hinge under a piece of trim, then let the whole outside weather down over decades until it looked like the same tired back wall as any other outbuilding in the county. Her grandfather. It had to have been. There was nobody else who would have had reason. She worked at the mortar around what she now understood was a second door, chipping it away with the edge of the pry bar until the outline of a narrow doorway showed clearly in the stone. It took her the rest of the morning. Her hands went numb in the cold twice, and she had to stop and warm them under her arms before she could grip the tool again. When she finally got enough of it cleared to try the handle, the door did not budge. She braced her boot against the stone and put her shoulder into it, and the handle turned easily enough under her grip. It was not locked, not in any way she could find. Something heavy was braced across it from the other side. She stepped back, wiped the sweat and the stone dust off her forehead with the sleeve of her coat, stood there in the yard with the wind coming down off the ridge, and thought about what that single detail meant. A forgotten room behind an old wall was strange enough on its own. A forgotten room that had been deliberately barred shut from the inside was something else entirely. Somebody had gone into that room, and somebody had walked out of it, and somebody had wanted whatever was in there to stay put after they were gone. That was not the shape of a hiding place. That was the shape of something being sealed away. She thought about her grandfather. She had been 6 years old when he passed in the spring of 1947, and her memories of him were scattered and half-lit the way a child's memories always are. She remembered him in a wooden rocker on the front porch of the old house, whittling something small in his hands. She remembered the smell of his shaving soap and the roughness of his palm when he had cupped the back of her head one morning before she left for school. She remembered him quiet in a way her father never was. A man who did his talking with his hands and let other people fill the silences if they wanted to. She did not remember him talking about the smokehouse. She did not remember him talking about much of anything, if she was honest. He had died before she was old enough to ask him the questions that mattered. She stood there in the yard for another minute, looking at the outline of the door in the stone, and she made a decision. She was going to find out what was on the other side of it. Whatever it was. If it was money, she would use it to pay down the banknote. If it was some old family shame, she would let it stay buried. Either way, she was going to know. But before she took a saw to the timber bar on the other side of that door, there was one man in the county who might be able to tell her what she was looking at without her having to open it at all. She went inside the house long enough to wash her hands and put a sandwich together. She did not end up eating, and she got into the pickup and drove out to see Earl Whitfield. Earl was 82 years old that spring and lived alone in a small board and batten house on a piece of land his family had held nearly as long as the Mercers had held theirs 5 miles east along the Ridge Road, where the woods closed in on both sides and the mailboxes got farther apart. He had been Elias Mercer's oldest friend. The two of them had grown up on adjacent farms in the years before the first war, gone off to that war together, come back and worked the same fields for the next 30 years. Earl had been a pallbearer at her grandfather's funeral. She could still remember his face at the graveside, drawn and pale, and older than his years for that one afternoon. She pulled up the gravel drive slow, giving him time to see the truck coming and get to his feet if he was inclined to. His old blue heeler came out from under the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps, watching her tail, giving one uncertain wag. Earl came out through the screen door a minute later, moving slow the way he moved now, a hand-carved cane in his right and his left hand on the porch rail. He looked at her without surprise, which was the first thing that struck her. "Danielle, you come a long way for a visit." "Not that long. I need to ask you about something." He waited. He did not offer her a chair or ask her inside. He just stood there on the porch and waited. So she stood in the yard and told him. She told him about starting the T-round, about the pry bar and the board coming loose, about the flashlight beam finding the iron handle, about the mortar and the mismatched stone and the reverse nails and the hinge under the trim, about the door being braced shut from the inside. Earl did not look surprised. That was the second thing that struck her, and it struck her harder than the first. He was quiet for a moment, looking off toward the tree line, rather than at her, his mouth working slightly. The way an old man's mouth works when he is choosing between what he wants to say and what he thinks he ought to. "Your grandfather did not talk about that place." His voice came out lower than she had expected, the way a man's voice comes out when he has been holding a thing a long time. Danny felt the cold along her back that had nothing to do with the wind. "What place?" Earl did not answer that. He looked at her for another moment, his eyes wet at the corners, in the way old eyes get in cold air, and then he turned and went back inside his house. The screen door closed behind him with a quiet slap of spring metal. Danny stood there on the porch steps with more questions than she had come with, and the very clear understanding that Earl Whitfield had known exactly what she was going to ask him the moment her truck pulled up his drive. She drove home, turning it over in her mind the whole way. A locked room, deliberately hidden, that one man old enough to remember it would not discuss. It was the kind of thing that got a person thinking about buried money or bootleg liquor or some family secret nobody had wanted uncovered. Danny was not sure which possibility unsettled her more. Her grandfather had lived through the tail end of Prohibition on a farm in the Ozarks, and the hills between here and the Arkansas line had run with clear whiskey through the Depression and after. It would not have been out of character for a man to have kept a still, hidden in a wall, he did not want the revenue men finding. It also would not have been out of character for a man to have kept something worse hidden, and Danny did not want to know what worse might have looked like on her own grandfather's ground. The gravel of her own drive was crunching under the tires when she saw the second vehicle already parked in front of the house. A dark blue Buick waxed to a shine that did not belong on a farm road in March, its tires still clean from the highway. She knew whose car it was before she had come to a full stop. She had seen it in the bank parking lot every time she had gone in to try to talk terms. Harlan Whitcomb stepped out of the driver's side as she killed the engine, adjusting the front of his overcoat and smoothing back the thin gray hair the wind had lifted off his scalp. 58 years old, president of Ozark County Trust for the last 19 of them, and the sort of man who wore a tie to walk across a pasture. He waited for her at the foot of her own porch steps with the easy patience of a man who had never been told to leave a place in his life. "Danielle, hope I am not catching you at a bad time." Danny closed the truck door harder than she had meant to. "I have work to do, Mr. Whitcomb, same as most days." "I understand. I will not keep you long." He gave her the smile that had probably closed 1,000 loans in his career, the smile of a man who thought smiles were currency. "I have been thinking about our conversation last month, and I wanted to come out personally to make sure you knew that the offer I mentioned is still on the table. I do not want to see a good family lose a good piece of ground because a payment schedule caught up faster than anyone expected." The offer he had mentioned, that was how he was phrasing it now. In February, sitting across his desk at the bank, he had put a piece of paper in front of her with a figure written on it that would have covered the balloon payment and left her with almost nothing. He had explained that a certain investment group he was helping to advise had an interest in properties along that stretch of the Ridge Road. Quality limestone in the bedrock, he had told her. A quarry operation could pull 30 years of stone out of ground like hers without anyone up on the county road ever hearing the difference. Danny had told him no. She had told him no in a voice that had not left any room for it to be misheard. And here he was 2 months later, standing at the foot of her steps, telling her that the offer was still on the table. "I have not changed my mind." "I appreciate that. I really do. There is a lot to be said for a family holding on to what a family has built." He paused. He looked past her out across the pasture in a way she recognized from having watched men do it her whole working life. Men who wanted you to know they were assessing the value of what they were looking at. "But I would be doing you a disservice if I did not tell you that 90 days is not a very long window, and the bank's board has been asking me questions I do not have very good answers for." What kind of questions? Whether we ought to be pursuing more aggressive remedies. There are options available to the bank in a situation like yours that neither of us wants to see explored. He gave the smile again. It was the same smile it had been the first time. I would rather work something out privately between the two of us that lets you walk away from this in a stronger position than the alternative. That is all I am here to say. Danny felt the anger rising up her spine the way it rose when a machine on the shop floor tried to spit a bar back at her. Slow, patient, contained. She had learned a long time ago never to let it out where it could be seen. I appreciate your concern for my position. I will meet the note when it comes due. With what, Danielle? His voice went softer in the way a man's voice went softer when he wanted you to hear him as reasonable. I have looked at your operation. Your father was a good man. He was not a good businessman these last few years, and neither of us can pretend otherwise. 40 head of cattle in a market this soft will not touch what you owe. And I would hate to see you take out a second mortgage on top of the first just to buy yourself another year of the same trouble. That is my concern, Mr. Whitcomb, not yours. He held her eyes for a long moment, long enough that she understood what he was doing without him having to say it. He was measuring her the way a man measures a horse he thinks he is about to buy at a low price. And what he saw in her face made him give the smile one more time, the way a man smiles when he has decided he can afford to wait. You have my number. If anything changes, do not hesitate to call. 90 days can go quicker than a person expects. He tipped the front of his hat toward her. He walked back to the Buick with the same unhurried step he had come in with. The car started up smoother than any car had a right to on a gravel drive, and it rolled back down toward the county road without kicking up a single stone. Danny stood there watching the taillights until they were gone. She went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table with her coat still on. She did not turn on a lamp. She let the last of the daylight come in through the west window, and she sat there in the graying quiet and thought about what she was going to do. The door in the smokehouse could wait until morning. She did not sleep well. She dreamed once about her father in a way she had not dreamed about him since November, and she woke up in the dark with the sheet twisted around her ankles and the wind moving through the eaves of the old house in a sound she had known since she was a girl. She stood in the drive with her hands in her coat pockets, and she did the math. It had been 6 hours between Harlan Whitcomb's Buick pulling out of her drive and full dark falling. Somebody would have had to know she was not going to leave the property between those hours. Somebody would have had to have been watching close enough to be sure. And somebody would have had to have wanted her to understand exactly what kind of remedies the bank's board had been asking questions about. She did not touch the nails. She left them where they were. She walked back down the yard to the smokehouse and picked up the cross-cut saw out of the wheelbarrow and stood at the door of the little back room she had exposed the day before. She was still standing there 5 minutes later when she heard the second vehicle come up her drive. It was not a Buick this time. It was an old brown Ford pickup. She did not recognize its right front fender, a different color from the rest of the body, its bed loaded with 2 green plastic tarps folded over something bulky. It stopped in front of the house. The driver's door opened. A man got out who Danny had not seen in 20 years. Curtis Mercer. I was 51 years old, thin, the way some men got thin from cigarettes and hard living rather than from work. And he stood beside the pickup for a moment, looking at the house and the yard and the smokehouse in the distance, the way a man looks at a place he is calculating the resale value of. He was her father's cousin's boy. The Mercer line branched twice in her great-grandfather's generation, and Curtis had come out of the branch that had gone south into Arkansas and then further south still, and Donnie had not laid eyes on him since her uncle's funeral in the spring of 1967. He had been in the Marines then. He had not been in anything steady since, from what she had heard. She set the saw down against the smokehouse wall. She walked up the yard toward him with her hands empty at her sides. Curtis? Danielle. He gave her a smile that did not go anywhere near his eyes. Been a long time. Sorry about your daddy. I would have come up for the service if I had heard about it sooner. You would have had to have been looking to hear about it. I did not send an announcement. No, well. He looked past her at the smokehouse. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he already knew was there. I hear you have been keeping busy out here. Who did you hear that from? Word gets around, Danielle, even down where I have been. He said it lightly in the way a man says a thing lightly when he wants the weight underneath it to do the work. I hear you found something. Danny felt the cold along her back that she had felt on Earl Whitfield's porch, and she understood in that moment that whatever Harlan Whitcomb was doing was not being done alone. Somebody had gotten word to Curtis Mercer down in Arkansas within the last 48 hours. Somebody who had known that the mere idea of something being found on the Mercer place would be enough to bring Curtis 200 miles north on 12 hours' notice. She kept her voice level. "I have not found anything. That is not what I heard." Curtis leaned back against the fender of his pickup. He crossed his arms in front of his chest in a way she remembered from the last time she had seen him, the way of a man who wanted to look casual while he was setting up a play. "Now, I am not here to fight with you. You are family, I know that. But the Mercer line comes through my grandfather, same as it comes through yours, and my daddy always told me that the acreage up here was supposed to have been split 3 ways when your grandfather passed, not left whole to your daddy the way it was. There was some business about the will that never sat right with anyone on our side. Your daddy never mentioned any of that to my daddy while my daddy was still alive to answer for it. My daddy was a peaceable man. I am not saying he was wrong to be, but peaceable does not mean forgetful." Curtis let the smile come back. "I am saying if there is something on this ground that changes the picture, we ought to talk about it like family, before it turns into the kind of thing lawyers get involved in." Danny looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his eyes, and she looked at the way he had positioned himself against the pickup, and she looked at the 2 green tarps in the bed. She had grown up on this ground. She had spent 22 years working with hard men in a machine shop. She knew a threat when she heard one, whether it was spoken plain or dressed up in family talk. "There is nothing on this ground that changes any picture, Curtis. There is a farm that is falling apart faster than one person can hold it together, and there is a banknote that is going to eat me alive in 90 days. That is the whole story. You are welcome to a cup of coffee before you drive back down. You are not welcome to anything else." Curtis held her eyes. His smile stayed on his face without going anywhere behind it. "I will pass on the coffee. I got a room over in Willow Springs. I am going to be around a few days, Danielle. Just visiting, reconnecting with family." He pushed off the fender and opened the driver's door. "You think about what I said. Family ought to be able to talk about family business without it going ugly." He got in and drove off. Danny watched the tail lights disappear the same way she had watched Harlan Whitcomb's the evening before, and she stood in her own drive with the smell of exhaust settling out of the cold air. And she understood that she had 2 men circling her now instead of 1. She walked back down to the smokehouse. She picked up the saw. She stood in front of the second door, and she set the teeth of the blade against the timber bar that was braced across it from the inside, and she pulled the first stroke. The wood was harder than she expected. The saw bit slow. Whatever the bar was made from it had been cut from good timber and cured a long time before it had ever been put to this use, and the blade she was pushing across it complained with every stroke. She worked at it steady. She let the anger she had carried up from the drive go into her shoulders and her arms. She thought about Harlan Whitcomb's smile, and Curtis Mercer's crossed arms, and Earl Whitfield turning his back on her porch, and the saw bit deeper. It took her nearly an hour. When the last of the timber gave, it did not snap so much as it separated the 2 halves of the bar, falling away from each other with a dry, hollow sound she felt in her teeth. She set the saw down. She wiped her palms on her jeans. She reached for the iron handle. The door swung open on its own weight, groaning against the old hinge in a low protest of metal that had not moved in longer than she had been alive. The morning light came in past her shoulders and reached into a room that had not seen daylight since before her father was born. It was small. Roughly 8 feet by 12, she guessed, though she did not measure. It was dry. It was undisturbed. It smelled faintly of old wood and dust, rather than the damp rot she had expected from a room sealed against a hillside for half a century. There was no gold, no cash box, no stack of clear whiskey jars catching her flashlight the way she had half been braced for. Nothing at all like what a person's imagination might have built up walking out there with a saw in her hand. Wooden shelves lined the walls holding dozens of old glass jars, most of them empty. Now their paper labels faded past reading in the dim light that reached her from behind. Burlap sacks that had once held seed sat folded and stacked in one corner, the fabric gone soft and colorless with age. A few canning tools hung from a nail beside the door. A small tin of salt sat on one shelf. An old brass balance scale sat on another, its pan still clean, its beam still level. A handful of wooden crates were stacked along the back wall, the kind a farmer might use to move produce to a market. And on the shelf nearest the door, close enough that she could reach it without stepping all the way inside, sat a notebook. leather-bound, cracked along the spine, the color of it long since faded to the same tired brown as the wood underneath it. Danny stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time before she moved. She was breathing shallow the way a person breathes when they know they are about to see something they cannot unsee, and she had to make herself put her hand out and pick the notebook up. She carried it to the doorway where the light was better. She lifted the cover. On the first page in faded ink and a handwriting she did not recognize, but somehow knew someone had written a single line. 1936, 1941. She sat down on the crate nearest the door because her knees told her to. The notebook came open across her thigh with a soft creak of leather that had gone stiff from decades of being closed, and the pages felt warmer under her fingers than they had any right to be after a winter spent behind sealed stone. She read the first entry twice before her mind would take it in. Mrs. Carter, 12 pounds beans. February 1936. The line was written in a hand she could tell right away belonged to a man who had learned his letters at a country schoolhouse and had never had much occasion to improve them since. The strokes were careful. The words leaned slightly forward the way a plow leans into ground it means to break. The ink had gone the color of weak tea in the 51 years since it had been laid down, but the shape of every letter still held. She turned the page. The Miller family. 2 jars meat. March 1936. Her eyes moved down the column and found more of the same. A name, a quantity, a month. No $sign anywhere. No column ruled for payment. No signature written beside any entry to show that a thing had been agreed to, or paid back, or reckoned even. Just what had been taken by whom on which day of which year. Danny turned another page. And another. The names came at her out of the paper, the way names come, at a person out of a hymn book, at a funeral, familiar and unfamiliar, both at once. Ashby, Prescott, Reddick, Coyle, Van Hoos. She half recognized some of them from the mailboxes along the county roads she had driven her whole life. Others she had never heard of. A few families whose grandchildren she had gone through the school system with in Willow Springs, back when the school still had 2 rooms and a coal stove in each. She kept reading. The entries ran steady through the balance of 1936 and into 1937 and all the way through 1939 without ever running dry. Some pages held only 3 or 4 names. Others held more. A pattern to them slowly took shape in her mind as she turned the leaves the way a shape takes form in a fog when a person keeps walking toward it. Certain families appeared only during winter months. Others appeared only during the weeks that came right before harvest, when the previous year's stores had run out and the current year's had not yet come in. A slow ledger of a slow disaster kept in a hand that showed no hurry and no grief and no comment. Then she reached 1940 and the pattern changed. The number of names on each page jumped hard. Where a page had held 4 or 5 entries through the late 30s, the pages from the spring of 1940 forward held 12, 15, 20. She turned to the summer of that year. She turned to the fall. Family after family who had never appeared once through the whole first stretch of the book began showing up in tight clusters, some of them month after month for the whole balance of the year, others just once a single line, and then nothing more, as though whatever trouble had brought them to the door had passed as quick as it had come. She was looking at something bigger than a private arrangement between neighbors. She was looking at whatever had happened on this ridge in the years right before the war, and she did not yet know what to call it. She noticed the second thing on her second pass through the pages. She almost missed it. She had settled into the rhythm of her grandfather's handwriting. By then the forward lean, the tight loops on the G's and the Y's, the way he crossed his 7s flat across the middle in the European style, he must have picked up somewhere and never let go of. It was because she had settled into that rhythm that her eye caught on the entries where the rhythm broke. Here and there through the pages a different hand had made the entry. Looser, quicker, the letters standing straight up instead of leaning. A hand that pressed harder on the downstrokes, as though whoever was holding the pen had not spent enough of their life writing to keep the pressure even. The entries in the second hand were scattered through the book without any pattern she could see. 2 in 1 week, then nothing for a month, then 3 more in the same week again. Somebody else had been writing in this book. Somebody her grandfather had trusted enough to hand the pen to. Somebody who had known about the room and been allowed inside it, and been given the authority to record the taking without being watched over. Danny sat back against the wall of the crate and looked at the shelves in the dim light. She thought about how many people it must have taken to keep something like this quiet for 5 straight years. Whoever the second hand belonged to had lived in this county, had known her grandfather well enough to be trusted with the whole shape of the thing, was almost certainly dead by now going by the arithmetic of who her grandfather's peers had been. Almost certainly. Not certainly. She closed the book. She held it in her lap for a long moment with her palms flat over the cracked leather. Then she stood up, brushed the dust of 5 decades off the back of her jeans, and carried the ledger out of the room into the daylight where she could see it better. She would go into town in the morning. She would take the book with her. She would sit down at the little table in the back of the Historical Society office, where the church rolls and the county death registers were kept, and she would find out who was still alive out of the names on those pages. If nobody was, she would still have work to do. If somebody was, then somebody in this county was going to know things she needed to know. She spent the balance of the afternoon pulling the 4 nails out of her tires with a pair of needle-nose pliers, patching what could be patched, moving what could not be moved out to the barn, where at least it was undercover. The front driver's side tire on the truck held long enough for her to get it into the shed. The wheelbarrow tire she gave up on. She left the truck jacked up on the drive and walked back inside the house at dusk with grease on her hands and a low burn of anger in her stomach that would not settle down no matter how much bread she ate against it. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under the lamp and a piece of legal paper beside it, and she went through the book page by page from beginning to end, copying out every name that appeared. She wrote down the month and the year of each entry. She noted which entries were in her grandfather's hand and which were in the second. It took her past midnight to get through the whole book. When she was done, she had 93 separate family names on her list, some of them appearing once, others appearing 30 or 40 times across the run of the book. The count of the second hand came out to 61 entries. 61 times some other person had come into that back room and made a record. She sat with the number for a long time. Whoever it was, they had not been a visitor. They had been a keeper. She got up early the next morning. She put the ledger and the legal pad into a canvas satchel her father had used for feed store trips. She put a hard biscuit in her pocket. She drove into Willow Springs on the patched tire, taking the curve slow, watching the pressure gauge on the dash the whole way in. The Historical Society kept its office in what had been a doctor's front parlor before the doctor had retired to Florida in the 60s. It sat between the barbershop and the drugstore on the west side of the square, and the woman who ran it 3 days a week was a retired schoolteacher named Ruth Chalfant, who had been in her mother's Sunday school class 40 years earlier. Ruth was 71 now, small, sharp, wearing a pair of half-moon reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked up from a card catalog when the bell over the door announced Danny, and her face softened in the way it had softened at the funeral in September. "Danielle, I did not think I would see you in here. I need your help with something if you can spare the time. I have got nothing but time on a Wednesday. Come sit down." Danny sat at the small oak table beside the front window. She opened the satchel. She did not take the ledger out yet. She took the list. "I have got a piece of family history I am trying to sort out. I have a set of names from the late 30s and early 40s. I need to know which of them still have people living in the county." Ruth put on her glasses. She took the list. Her eyes moved down the first column, and Danny watched her expression shift twice. Small changes in the set of her mouth that a person would only catch if they were watching for them. "That is a lot of names." "I know. May I ask where you got them?" Danny had been thinking about this on the drive in. She had decided that she was not going to lie to Ruth Chalfant, because Ruth had never earned a lie from her, but she was not going to hand over the whole shape of the thing either. Not until she knew what she was standing on. "I am going through my grandfather's papers. He had a book that kept a record of a lot of families my family did business with. I wanted to see who was left." Ruth held her eyes for a moment over the top of the glasses. She did not press. "All right, give me the morning. I can go through the church rolls at the Methodist and the Baptist both, and I have got the county death index right back here. We can do most of this without leaving the room." They worked through the morning. Ruth moved between the card catalog and a row of file cabinets along the back wall, pulling out drawer after drawer, cross-checking the names against yellowed index cards and typewritten pages that smelled of paste and old paper. Danny sat at the table with the list and marked each name as Ruth called out its status. Deceased 1961. Deceased 1954. Moved to Kansas in the 50s, no living kin in the county. Deceased 1972. Deceased 1949. The list grew shorter in the ways that mattered as the morning wore on, and Danny felt something in her chest tightening with every name Ruth crossed off, because with every one of them, another door was closing on whoever might still be able to tell her what she needed to know. By 11:30, they had gone through 81 of the 93 names. 74 were confirmed dead. 5 had moved out of state before the war and left no descendants Ruth could track. 2 had grandchildren still in Willow Springs, but those grandchildren would have been small children in 1941 and would not remember. 12 names remained on the list. At 11:40, Ruth stopped at one of the middle drawers and lifted out a card and held it in her hand for a moment before she looked up. Marlene Hollis. What about her? She is still alive. Danny sat forward. How old? 79, according to this. She lives out on the old Turner Creek Road past where the pavement ends. Her name was on your list twice, once in 1937 and once in 1941. I remember Marlene from when I was a girl. She used to sing at the Baptist every Easter. Danny looked down at her legal pad. She had written the Hollis entries down along with the rest without thinking twice about them. 3 pounds flour, February 1941. 2 pounds cornmeal, March 1937. Both in her grandfather's hand. Is she in her right mind? Last time I saw her at the store, which was maybe 8 months ago, she was as sharp as you or me. Sharper, if we are being honest. Danny closed the legal pad. She thanked Ruth. She left the ledger in the satchel because some instinct told her not to spread it any further than she had to. She got back in the truck and drove out toward Turner Creek with the sun climbing high and thin over the ridges and the road turning to gravel and then to dirt as the miles fell away behind her. She got as far as the feed store on the way out because she needed to pick up 2 sacks of laying mash for the hen house and a length of hardware cloth to patch a gap in the coop wire. She pulled up in the parking lot and went inside and set the sacks up on the counter, and Delbert Sowards, who had owned the feed store since her father was a young man, looked at her from behind the counter with an expression that did not read the way it usually read. Danielle, how are you today? Getting by. Put these on the account, Delbert. I will square up at the end of the month, same as always. Delbert did not touch the sacks. He held her eyes for a moment. I am going to have to ask you to pay cash today, Danielle, or write me a check for it. Danny felt the floor of the store tilt very slightly under her boots. You have been carrying the Mercer account for 35 years. I know that. I know your father, God rest him, never once let it go past 30 days. Delbert looked past her shoulder at the front window as though he wished it were farther away than it was. I have been told by the folks who carry my paper that I need to be a little more careful about the accounts I run right now. I do not have any say in it. I am sorry. Who told you? Danielle. Who told you, Delbert? Delbert looked at her for a long moment. He was 73 years old. He had put up with a lot in his life. He had the look of a man who did not want to be doing what he was doing. Ozark County Trust does the note on this building. I do not tell them how to do their business. They do not usually tell me how to do mine. Yesterday they did. He wet his lips. I am not saying that is what is going on here. I am saying I have got to take cash from you today. Danny stood at the counter for a full 10 seconds without moving. She could feel a heat rising up the side of her neck. She reached into her back pocket. She took out the small folding wallet she kept there. She counted out $23.40 in bills and change and set the money on top of the sacks. Thank you, Delbert. Danielle, I did not want to do this. I know you did not. That is not what I am angry about. She carried the sacks out to the truck herself. She loaded them in the bed. She got in and drove on toward Turner Creek without looking back at the store. By the time she got to the end of the pavement, her hands had stopped shaking on the wheel. The anger had done what anger always did with her, which was settle down into the low, steady burn she could work off of. Marlene Hollis lived in a small white farmhouse set back from the road behind 2 old sycamores that had gone bare for the winter. The paint on the siding was clean. The porch was swept. A wind chime made of old silverware hung from the eave beside the front door, moving lightly in the air off the creek. Danny parked at the end of the drive and walked up. A curtain moved in the front window before she reached the steps. The door opened before she knocked. Marlene Hollis was a small woman. Not frail. Small. Her hair had gone white years ago, pulled back in a loose braid that hung over one shoulder. Her eyes were the pale blue color Danny associated with old porcelain, and they were sharper than Danny had expected them to be. You are Nathan Mercer's girl. Yes, ma'am. You look like him. I have been told that. Marlene held the door. Come in, honey. The kettle just went on. The inside of the house was neat and warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender. Marlene led her through to a small sitting room off the kitchen where a wood stove ticked quietly in the corner. Danny sat down on a horsehair love seat that had probably been in the house since Marlene's mother's time. Marlene sat across from her in a straight-backed rocker, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Danny did not know how to begin. She had thought about it on the drive out. She had rehearsed 3 different ways of asking, and each of them had felt wrong the moment she pictured herself saying it. She sat there with the satchel across her knees for a long moment, and finally she just opened it and took the ledger out and set it on the small table between them. Marlene looked at the book. She did not touch it. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. I found this in the back of my grandfather's smokehouse, behind a door that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Danny watched Marlene's face as she spoke. She did not see surprise. She did not see denial. She saw something else, something older that settled into the lines around the woman's mouth, like a thing coming back to a place it had been before. Your name is in it, twice, in 1937 and 1941. Marlene closed her eyes for a moment. I have been asking around all morning. Most of the families in this book are gone. You are one of the few people still alive who might know what I am looking at, and I need to know. Marlene did not open her eyes right away. When she did, they were wet at the corners in a quiet way. She reached out with one hand, and she rested her fingertips on the cover of the ledger. She did not open it. She just rested her hand there. I have not seen this book in 46 years. I did not think anyone would ever see it again. You knew about it. I knew about it. Danny let the silence sit. She had learned from 22 years around old men that if you left a silence alone long enough, a person who wanted to talk would come around to talking. Marlene drew a breath. She looked toward the wood stove for a moment. Then she looked at Danny. In the winter of 1941, my husband Walter took sick. Not the bad kind. He got over it. But he lay in bed for 6 weeks with it, and he could not work, and I could not leave the house long enough to work, either because I had our 2 little ones to look after. We had a milk cow and 18 chickens and half a smokehouse of cured pork left over from that fall, and we thought that would see us through. It saw us to the middle of February. Then it did not. Marlene's voice was even. She was not telling it for pity. She was telling it the way a person tells a thing they have carried a long time and never had a place to set down. The morning I walked to your grandfather's place, there was snow on the ground, up past my boot tops, 7 miles across the ridge road. I had wrapped my feet in newspaper inside my boots because my socks were not going to be enough. I had not eaten in a day and a half. What we had left, I had left for the children and Walter. She looked at Danny steadily. I was 33 years old. I had never asked another human being for anything in my life. I did not know how I was going to make my mouth form the words. What did my grandfather do? He did not make me say them. That is what he did. Marlene's mouth moved very slightly the way a mouth moves when it is trying to hold something. I walked up his drive. He was at the woodpile at the side of the house. He looked up and he saw me, and he saw what shape I was in, and he did not say hello. He said, "Come with me." That is all. He walked me around to the back of the smokehouse. He opened a door I had not known was there. He went inside and he came back with a sack of flour and a jar of lard and a small piece of smoked pork wrapped in paper, and he handed it to me. He did not ask me what had happened. He did not ask me to promise anything. He did not tell me not to say anything. All he said was, "Get home safe, Mrs. Hollis. Come back if the weather closes in again. Get to mama chimashush." And he went back to his woodpile. Danny realized she was not breathing. She let out the breath she had been holding. Walter got better in April. The children grew up. My oldest Ella sits on the county bench now. My youngest passed 9 years ago in a car accident up in Rolla and is buried in the churchyard here. Both of them lived their lives because a man I had never spoken to before that morning did not make me say the words. Marlene's eyes came back to Danny. I went back once more in April to thank him. He walked me to my car. I would not take a thing from me. All he said when I was getting in the seat was, "A person who has had to ask for food remembers what that feels like the rest of her life. Nobody in this valley is going to have to remember it on my account." Then he closed my door. Danny felt something in her throat she had not expected to feel. She held it down. She had come here for information. She had not come to sit in a stranger's parlor and cry over a grandfather she had barely known. There is a second hand in the ledger, not his, I need to know whose. Marlene looked at her steadily. Earl Whitfield. The name landed the way she had suspected it would. Danny sat with it for a moment. He knew. He was one of the first people your grandfather told. Him and one other. Your grandfather was already 48 years old in 1936. He had a bad hip from the war. He could not always get out to the smokehouse fast when someone came, and there were stretches when he was down sick for a week at a time. He needed a second set of hands he could trust to keep the book. Earl was the only person in the county he trusted that much. Who was the other? Marlene shook her head slightly. Your grandfather never told me. Whoever it was, they did not write in the book. Whoever it was somebody who went home in the evenings to a family and did not talk about the day. All I ever knew was that there were two men who kept the room open. One of them wrote. The other one did not. Danny thought about that. She let it settle. Something in it did not quite fit. Someone else had known. Someone else had been part of this. Someone else was possibly still alive. She would come back to it. She did not have room for it yet. Why did Earl not talk to me about this when I went out to see him? Because he swore to your grandfather he never would. Marlene's voice went softer. Your grandfather did not want the families in this book to ever know their names were in a book at all. He believed that a person who takes charity is asked to carry that shame forever afterward, whether the person who gave the charity means to make them carry it or not. He kept the book so he would remember. He made sure nobody else could look at it and remember with him. Danny felt the anger she had carried into Earl's yard the morning before shift into something else in her chest. Not gone, repositioned. She had accused an old man in his silence of something that had not deserved the accusation. She would have to sit with that. You said your son Ellis is on the bench. He is. He was appointed after Judge Meacham retired in '79. He does the family cases mostly. He knows nothing about any of this, and I would ask you to please never tell him. Why? Marlene's mouth softened into the smallest kind of smile. Because it would break him, Danielle. And your grandfather would not have wanted him broken by it either. Donnie nodded. She would honor that. Whatever came next, she would honor it. She stayed at the Hollis house another 20 minutes. Marlene made her drink a full cup of coffee and eat a piece of buttered cornbread from an iron skillet on the stovetop. She did not ask why Danny had come looking after all these years. She did not ask what Danny was going to do with what she had learned. She let Danny leave the way Elias Mercer had let her leave 46 years earlier, without asking her for a promise she had not offered. Danny drove home along the ridge road with the ledger back in the satchel beside her on the seat. She thought about Earl Whitfield turning his back on her porch. She thought about his eyes wet in the cold air. She thought about the vow he had held for 40 years and the fact that she had walked up his drive and demanded he break it, and about what a small, heavy thing pride was in a young woman standing on an old man's steps. The next 2 days, she did not leave the property. She spent one of them running new wire along the top strand of the south pasture fence where the old barbed had gone soft, using the last of the roll she had picked up in the fall. She spent the other one splitting stove wood ahead of a cold front the radio said was coming down out of Nebraska. On the third night, she woke at 2:15 to a sound that did not belong. It was the sound of a wire being cut. A single high metallic ping, muffled by distance and by the wall of the house, but unmistakable to a woman who had been running fence with her father since she was tall enough to hold the pliers. Then a second ping, then a third. She was out of bed before her boots hit the floor. She pulled on her father's barn coat over her long johns and grabbed the .22 rifle from the corner beside the wardrobe, the one her father had kept there for coyotes, and she went down the stairs 2 at a time without turning on a light. The kitchen was cold. She did not stop for a lamp. She went out through the mudroom and stood on the back porch with the rifle held low across her body, and she listened. The pings were coming from the north fence line, 200 yards up the pasture where the barbed wire cut across the top of the low-rise between her land and the county road. She moved along the side of the barn in the dark. She had walked that ground 10,000 times. She could have walked it blindfolded. She stayed in the shadow of the fence line, and she came up on the rise from downwind, and when she was 50 yards out, she could see them. 2 men, one at the near end of the section, one at the far. Both of them working a set of bolt cutters through the top strand of the wire. A third silhouette back at a pickup, parked at the edge of the county road with its lights off. She raised the rifle. She did not aim at either of them. She aimed at the trunk of the big black walnut 15 feet above the head of the nearer man. She squeezed the trigger. The report cracked across the frost like a chunk of stove wood splitting. The bark of the walnut split above the man's head, and a piece of it fell down onto his shoulder. He dropped the bolt cutters. Both of them ran. Not toward the pickup at first, which was 30 yards away, but sideways along the fence in pure panic, then finding their bearings and cutting back toward the truck at a dead sprint. Whoever was at the wheel had the engine started before they were in it. The door slammed and the truck was gone up the county road with its lights still off before Danny had lowered the rifle. She walked up to the fence in the cold. She did not hurry. She stood at the section they had been cutting, and she counted the strands. 2 cut clean through, a third started and abandoned. She looked at the ground. The bolt cutters were still there, dropped in the frost, where the nearer man had been standing when the rifle had spoken above his head. Beside them, half tucked into the brown grass at the base of the fence post, was a wool cap, dark blue. The band of it dark with the sweat of a man who had been working hard and cold at the same time. She picked the cap up. She turned it over in her hand under the moonlight, and she looked at the underside of the crown. Stitched into the lining in white thread against the dark wool was a bank logo. A small oval with the letters OCT worked into it in a script she had seen every month of her life on the statements that arrived in her father's mail. Ozark County Trust. Danny stood there in the pasture for a long moment with the cap in one hand and the rifle in the other, and she felt something in her that had been coiled tight for a week begin to uncoil in the direction it needed to. She had suspected. She had known without knowing. She had not been able to prove it. Now she had a wool cap with a bank logo sewn into it, dropped in her own pasture by a man who had run when she had put a rifle round into a tree over his head. She walked the cap back to the house. She did not turn on a lamp until she was inside with the door locked behind her. She set the cap on the kitchen table under the lamp. She sat down and looked at it. She did not smile, but something in her mouth loosened for the first time in 3 days, in the way a mouth loosens when a person understands that the fight ahead is one she can actually see the shape of. She wrapped the cap in a clean cloth. She put it in a box on the top shelf of the pantry. She would keep it there until she needed it. She had a feeling she would know when that day came. At sundown the following evening, she was inside the house heating water for a bath when she heard the truck. It was Curtis Mercer's brown Ford again. She was not surprised. She had been expecting it. She was surprised only that he had brought a second person with him this time. She turned the burner off under the pot. She put on her coat. She went out onto the porch and stood at the top of the steps. Curtis got out of his driver's side. The man who got out of the passenger side was in his mid-40s, wearing a rumpled brown suit, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. He had the look of somebody who had spent his career in courtrooms in small towns and had made a modest living at it and had never wanted to make more. "Danielle, I want you to meet Bill Fortner. Bill is out of Springfield. He is my attorney." Danny did not move from the top of the steps. She did not offer them the porch. She did not offer them the house. She stood where she stood and let the cold air do what talking needed doing. Fortner cleared his throat. He held up the portfolio a little. "Miss Mercer, I want to be straightforward with you. My client has asked me to file a claim against your grandfather's estate on the grounds of improper distribution at the time of probate in 1947. He believes that the will as executed did not reflect the intentions his grandfather understood to be part of the family arrangement, and he is entitled to a review by the county court. My grandfather died 40 years ago. Whatever there was to argue about would have been argued about then. Under normal circumstances, that would be true. Missouri Code, however, provides an exception for cases in which evidence of undisclosed assets comes to light after the original probate. If such evidence exists, the estate may be reopened and the distribution reviewed." Danny looked past Fortner at Curtis. Curtis was leaning against the fender of the Ford, with his arms crossed the way she had seen him lean the last time. He was watching her with a small, pleased look on his face, the look of a man who had waited his whole life to have somebody stand where she was standing and hear the things she was hearing. "There are no undisclosed assets on this property, Mr. Fortner. Then a review will find nothing, and my client will withdraw his claim. In the meantime, we are filing today with the county court in Willow Springs. The hearing will be scheduled at the court's convenience. I understand you have a matter pending with Ozark County Trust as well, and we have taken that into consideration when requesting the earliest possible date." Fortner paused. He looked as uncomfortable as any man in a rumpled brown suit could look. "The hearing will fall within the same 72-hour window as the bank's stated foreclosure date." Danny looked at him. She looked at Curtis. She understood then all at once and completely what had been arranged. Curtis had not come north on his own instinct. Curtis had been called. Curtis had been paid or promised to be by somebody who wanted to make sure that even if Danny found a way to raise the money to hold off Harlan Whitcomb's foreclosure, she would still be tied up in a court proceeding on the same day. It did not matter whether Curtis had a case. It only mattered that the case existed. It only mattered that on the day the bank came to take the farm, Danny would have to choose between being at the courthouse and being at the auction. She could see the plan sitting in the yard in front of her, the way a person sees a fence line in a fog once the fog lifts. Beautiful in its meanness, cheap to run, almost impossible to stop. You are going to lose in court, Curtis. I might. Bill here thinks it is a 50-50. 50-50 ain't bad. Curtis smiled the smile that had not gone anywhere near his eyes the first day. Even if I lose the whole thing outright, what is it going to cost you to fight it? What is it going to cost you not to be at the bank on Tuesday? You want to run those numbers, Danielle, or you want to save yourself the trouble and take the offer I have not made yet? Make it. 60%. You keep the house and 40 acres along the west line. I take the balance. The claim goes away. The banknote stays your problem, but at least it is a smaller problem. Fortner did not react. He had heard it before he heard it here. Danny let the offer hang for a long moment. She let it hang long enough that Curtis's smile started to shift at the edges. Get off my porch, both of you. They left. Fortner tipped his hat. Curtis did not tip his. The brown Ford rolled back down the drive without kicking up a stone, and Danny watched the taillights until they were gone. The same way she had watched Harlan Whitcomb's, and she understood that the two men had been coordinated closer than she had guessed even yesterday. She went inside the house. She did not take the bath. She sat at the kitchen table under the lamp, and she did the arithmetic on a piece of paper. $47,000 due to the bank in 11 days. The cattle would bring maybe 14 if she sold every head at once, and she would be selling at the bottom of a bad market. The equipment would bring another 6 or 7. The tractor was worth more than that if she had time to advertise it right, but she did not have time. She stopped writing at $24,000, and she stared at the number. She could bridge the rest if she signed a second mortgage on the acreage. Harlan Whitcomb would happily arrange one for her at a rate she would not be able to service. And inside 18 months, she would be back in this same chair, looking at these same numbers again, with less land to sell against them. She could sell the ledger. That thought moved across her mind cold and slow. She did not know who would buy it, but she knew Harlan Whitcomb had come here twice offering to buy anything old that turned up during her Tyrone, and she knew that a man like that would not have made the offer twice if he did not have somebody behind him ready to write a check. Whether that somebody wanted the book for what it was or wanted it destroyed so that whatever else it hinted at would never come to light, they would pay. They would pay enough. She could tell. She did not know how much, but she could tell they would pay enough. She sat with that for a long time. She got up. She walked out to the smokehouse in the dark with a flashlight in her hand, and she stood in the doorway of the little back room, and she looked at the shelves with the empty jars and the folded burlap sacks and the balance scale and the crates along the back wall. She had come out here to see whether she could bring herself to pack it up. She stood in the doorway. She turned the flashlight beam slowly across the shelves. She thought about Marlene Hollis walking 7 miles in snow and coming home with a sack of flour and a piece of pork. She thought about the words her grandfather had spoken at Marlene's car door, words a man had said aloud once in his whole life and never repeated. She thought about a man who had built a room to hold food nobody would have to beg for. She stepped inside. She started with the crates. She opened the flaps on the nearest one and looked in. It was full of old paper wrappers folded and stacked the kind a grocer might have used to package dry goods. She lifted the wrappers out. She set them aside. She looked at the next crate. She started to move it, meaning to pack the ledger inside it because it would fit clean and the wood would protect the leather in transport. Her fingers slid along the bottom shelf as she reached to steady herself. They passed over a gap, a narrow gap between the shelf and the wall, just wide enough that her fingertips slipped in past the first joint before she stopped. She held her hand there. She got down on one knee. She shone the flashlight along the gap. There was something wedged behind the shelf. She reached in and worked it out slowly. A sealed envelope, the paper gone brittle and yellow with age, the wax on the seal cracked but unbroken. She held it up in the flashlight beam. On the outside, in the same forward-leaning hand that had begun the ledger 51 years earlier, someone had written a single line: "If this room is ever opened again." She carried the envelope inside to the kitchen table because the light out in the smokehouse was not steady enough for what she needed to do with it. She set it on the wood in front of her under the lamp. She looked at the wax for a long moment before she broke it. 51 years the seal had held. Whatever her grandfather had put inside had waited longer than she had been alive to be read by somebody who would find the door. She used the tip of the paring knife off the drain board. The wax cracked cleanly along the seam. The flap lifted with a small sigh as though the paper had been holding a breath and was ready now to let it go. Inside was a single folded sheet of ledger paper cut from the same stock as the pages of the book itself. She unfolded it slowly. Her grandfather's handwriting filled the page from top to bottom without a wasted line. She read the letter 3 times before she let herself take any of it in. He had not written it to be found. He had written it in case it was. The distinction sat in every sentence. A person who has had to ask for food, he had put down in the second paragraph, remembers what that felt like for the rest of her life, and he would rather nobody in his community carry that weight if he could help it. That was why there was no debt recorded anywhere in the book, no signatures, no accounting of who owed what to whom. Just names and numbers kept quietly for no reason, but to remember who had needed help and when. Kept so that a man who had given a thing could hold in his own mind the shape of what he had given without ever letting the other person feel the weight of it. He had written that pride was a heavier thing to hand a neighbor than a sack of flour ever was, and that he had made his choice about which he was willing to hand and which he was not. He had written in the second-to-last paragraph about the room itself. He had built it with Earl Whitfield's help over a summer in 1935, working on it evenings after the fieldwork was done. Nobody in the county had seen it go up because they had built it inside the walls of a smokehouse that had already been standing for 5 years. The mismatched stone was every piece of dark rock he could scavenge from the far end of the property so as not to be seen coming and going from the quarry. The reverse nails were his own idea. He had wanted no board on that back wall to ever look like a board that had been put on it later. At the bottom of the letter, in a hand that had gone shakier by the time it got there, as though he had come back to add the final line, some months or years after the rest, he had left a single instruction. Only 2 sentences. Take what your family needs. Leave what the next family may need. Danny folded the letter along the same creases and set it on the table beside the ledger. She sat with her hands flat on the wood, and she did not move for a long time. She had come out to the smokehouse an hour earlier, meaning to pack the ledger into a crate to sell. She had come inside with an envelope in her hand instead, and now she had a piece of paper on her table that had put a name to what she had been standing on and turned it into something she could not sell without becoming a person she did not want to be. She thought about Harlan Whitcomb and Curtis Mercer and the offer that would come and had already come. She thought about the coordinated arithmetic of 2 men pressing her from opposite sides toward the same wall. She thought about what it would be worth to a man like Harlan to have this letter never see daylight, because a man who was buying up ridge ground to sell it to a limestone company for cash was a man whose grandfather had almost certainly not been on the list of names in the ledger. A man like that would not want the county reminded that some families in it had done the opposite of what he was doing now. She thought about the fact that her grandfather had left her the choice. He had not made it for her. He had left the room shut, the letter tucked behind the shelf, the ledger open on the front page. He had built the whole thing so that the choice would sit with whoever came after him without the pressure of his hand on their shoulder. Take what your family needs. It was permission. It was the kind of permission an old man gives from beyond the grave to a young woman he never got to meet grown. She could sell it. She could pay the note. She could keep the house. The letter would go into a safe somewhere, and the Ridge Road would grow a limestone quarry, and Danny Mercer would live out the rest of her life on 40 acres she still owned. Take what your family needs. He had told her that in as many words. Nobody would ever know it had been for sale. She would know. She went to bed after midnight. She lay in the dark for a long time listening to the house move around her, and just before she fell asleep, she made the decision she had been carrying all evening without letting herself name it. She was not going to sell the room. She was going to keep it. She was going to save the farm without selling it. She did not know yet how she was going to do that, but she knew before she slept that she was going to. She was up before 5. She fixed coffee she drank this time. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger, the letter, and a fresh legal pad, and she went at the problem the way she had gone at problems her whole working life. She wrote down what she had. She wrote down what she needed. She wrote down the pieces in between that she was going to have to build. What she had was 96 acres of paid-for ground with a banknote against it, 40 head of cattle in soft market, a tractor, a truck, a shop full of tools she had brought back from Rolla, a house, a barn, a grain bin, a smokehouse she now understood she was not tearing down. What she had was 10 days. What she needed was $47,000, or the assurance from somebody with money that $47,000 would be arriving inside a window the bank would accept. What she had that Harlan Whitcomb did not know she had was a room full of empty jars, folded burlap, in a small tin box she had not yet opened. She had noticed the tin the first day. It had been sitting in the bottom of the crate nearest the back wall, tucked beneath one of the burlap sacks, and she had left it there because there had been too much else to take in. She went out to the smokehouse now in the gray of the first light, and she brought it back to the kitchen. She opened it under the lamp. Seed packets. 24 of them, maybe more, folded flat and stacked in neat rows. Corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, peppers. The paper was brittle enough that she had to handle them by the edges. She lifted the top packet with 2 fingers and turned it into the light. The label had been drawn on with a pencil in her grandfather's forward-leaning hand, the way he had labeled the entries in the ledger. Above the variety name in the same pencil and letters, he had traced firmly enough that they had not faded in the way ink faded. He had written a single line across the top of every packet. Plant enough for 2 families. She held the packet a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went through the rest of them, one at a time. Every packet carried the same line. Some had additional notes underneath. Best in the low ground by the creek. Do not soak these before planting, they will rot. Save back a third for the following year. Practical instructions written by a man who had lived with the seeds his whole life and wanted whoever came behind him to have the same understanding. Her grandfather had not just been feeding families through the bad years. He had been running a seed system out of the same room. Every family that came through his door had gone home with more than what they could eat that week. He had been giving them the means to grow their own the following season and asking them in the language he had chosen to write across every packet to grow enough so that when the next family showed up hungry, there would be food for them too. The whole shape of the thing came together in Danny's mind then. It had not been charity. Charity was a one-way street. This had been a system, a working, self-refilling arrangement, hidden inside a smokehouse in a hollow in the Ozarks, sustained across 5 years by 2 men who never told anyone, refilled by neighbors who had never been asked to sign anything or promise anything or say a word out loud about it. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the seed packets spread across the kitchen table. She looked at the legal pad. She picked up the pen. The idea came to her in one piece. A person could see the whole plan the way a person sees the shape of a barn framed against the sky before a single board goes on the roof. She was going to plant the seeds. This spring, every packet. She was going to plant them on the 2 south-facing fields her father had let go fallow the last 3 years because he had not had the energy for row crops. She did not have the labor to work 40 acres of vegetables alone. She would not need to. She was going to bring the labor to her. She was going to walk up the driveways of every family whose name still had descendants in this county, 12 families by Ruth Chalfont's count, and she was going to make each of them the same offer. Their families' names were in a book their grandparents and great-grandparents had never known was being kept, a book that had recorded without judgment and without accounting the days their families had needed help and had received it. She was not going to show them the book. She was not going to embarrass them with it. She was going to tell them what it was, and she was going to offer them a partnership. Bring their tools, bring their hands, work the ground with her through the growing season. Take a share of the harvest at the end. She would take the smaller share because the ground was hers, but the split would be fair, and it would be written out plain so that nobody signing had to wonder whether they were being handled. She was going to build the same room again 20 times bigger in the open this time with everyone knowing. She did the arithmetic. 11 signed partnership agreements against future crop shares, assuming even a modest fall harvest at expected prices would carry a projection of income sufficient to satisfy any working commercial lender that the operation was viable. Not to Harlan Whitcomb, to somebody else. She would take the projection to First Ozark Savings in Kabul, 40 miles west, where the manager was a man named Roy Delacourt, who her father had known from a livestock association and who had no reason to owe Harlan Whitcomb anything at all. She wrote it out. She rewrote it twice. She went out to the barn as soon as the sun was fully up, and she paced the 2 fields, and she measured them off in her head. She came back inside and she checked her arithmetic against the acreage. She checked it a 3rd time. It would work. If she could get the signatures. If she could get Delacourt to see the same picture she was seeing. If she could hold Harlan and Curtis off long enough to walk the whole plan into place. She went into town that afternoon. She started with Ruth Chalfant because Ruth had the addresses of everyone still living. She sat down at the same oak table where she had gone through the names 2 days earlier, and she told Ruth what she was going to do. Not all of it. She told her that she needed to visit a list of families that she was putting together a farming arrangement that she was going to need to know where to find them. Ruth did not ask why. Ruth wrote out the addresses on a sheet of lined paper in a schoolteacher's hand and slid it across the table and said only one thing. "Whatever you are up to, Danielle, do not tell me until it is done. I want to be surprised." Danny smiled for the first time in a week. She began the drives that same afternoon. The first house belonged to a man named Tobias Ashby, who lived in a low white bungalow on the edge of town and was the grandson of the family that had come through the Smokehouse door most often across the run of the ledger. Tobias was 62, a widower, a retired mail carrier, who spent his mornings at the diner and his afternoons in a workshop behind his house, where he built cedar chests for his daughters. Danny knocked on his door at 3 in the afternoon and stood on his porch when he opened it. She spoke plain. She told him what she had found on her ground. She told him about the ledger without naming any families other than his own. She told him what his grandfather's name had appeared next to and how often and across which years. She watched Tobias Ashby's face change as she spoke. She watched him go from a man who had answered a knock at his door out of politeness to a man who was standing in a place he had not known was under his feet. "I never heard a word of this." Nobody did. That was the point. Tobias looked past her at his own yard, at the fence he had put up, at the truck in his drive. She let him have the moment. She had been having versions of it all week herself. "What is it you are asking of me, Danielle?" "I am not asking anything. I am offering." She laid out the plan. She was direct about the shares. She was direct about the risk. She did not sweeten it. She told him she had 11 other families to visit and that she was going to make the same offer to all of them, and that she would understand if he wanted to sleep on it before he gave her an answer. She told him what she was not going to do, which was ask him for a promise and never let him know why she was asking. Tobias Ashby looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who cried in front of women. She saw the shape of the thing move behind his eyes anyway. "I do not need to sleep on it." She got the first signature there on the tailgate of her truck in a driveway on the edge of town in the late light of a cold afternoon in March. Tobias walked back inside his house and came back out with a pen his son had given him for his 60th birthday, and he signed the sheet without asking for a copy, though she gave him one anyway. She got 2 more that same evening. She got 4 the next day. She spent the whole of the following morning at the kitchen table of a family named Reddick. 3 generations of them at the same table, arguing softly among themselves about acreage and labor before the grandfather. A man of 80 who had come to the table in his slippers held up one hand and quieted the room. His mother had walked to the Mercer place twice in 1938. He had been 6 years old that year. He had eaten what she had brought home without ever knowing where it had come from. He signed. His 2 sons signed under him. 3 signatures on 1 sheet. By Friday afternoon, she had 11. The 12th family, the Van Hoos family out on Little Piney, was gone from the house when she stopped by. She left a note under the door. She did not go back. 11 would be enough. She had checked the arithmetic 4 times. She drove to Kabul on Saturday morning with the folder of 11 signed partnership agreements on the seat beside her, along with a crop projection she had put together at the kitchen table over the course of 2 nights, showing First Ozark Savings a picture of a working farm with contracted labor and diversified output, and a demonstrated market for its produce through the county's existing feed and grocery channels. Roy Delacourt was 54 years old, gray at the temples, the sort of banker who had come up through the farm loan side of the business instead of through investment portfolios. He had known her father a little. He had not known her at all. She sat down across the desk from him, and she laid the folder open and she walked him through it, and she did not say a word about Harlan Whitcomb or Ozark County Trust until Delacourt asked her. The terms were fair. The interest rate was 3 points below what Whitcomb had been carrying. A signed commitment letter would be in her hands by hand-delivered courier the following morning in time for her to walk it into Ozark County Trust before Tuesday's foreclosure auction. Danny thanked him. She hung up the phone. She stood at the kitchen sink with her palms flat against the counter for a long minute. She did not cry. She had not cried for anything all week, and she was not going to start now. She still had the courthouse in the morning. Before that, she had one more visit to make. She drove out to Turner Creek in the last of the daylight. The wind chime by Marlene's door was still now hung motionless in the cold. Marlene came to the door before she knocked the way she had the first time. "Danielle, come in." "I cannot stay. I need to ask you something at the door." Marlene held the door open a hand's width. She waited. "Tomorrow morning I have to appear in front of your son, the claim Curtis Mercer filed against the estate. I am going to be representing myself, and I am going to have to enter the ledger into the record to show the court what he thinks I found." Danny's voice was even. "Your son is going to see it. He is going to see your name, and he is going to see the letter because it is folded inside the front cover. I am not going to be able to leave those things out." Marlene did not answer right away. Her hand stayed on the edge of the door. Her pale blue eyes held Danny's for a long moment. "You are asking me to release you from the thing I asked of you last week." "I am." Marlene looked past her out at the porch light in the cold beyond it. She thought for a long moment. When she looked back, something in her face had settled. "My son is 55 years old. He has been on the bench for 8 of those years. He has heard worse than what is in that book. What he has not heard is anything true about the man his mother was before he knew her." She paused. "Show him. Let him see the letter. If he wants to talk to me about it afterward, he can drive out here and talk. I have been ready for that conversation for 46 years. Are you sure?" Marlene's mouth softened into the smile Danny had seen on her once before. "A woman who walks 7 miles in the snow at 33 does not lose her nerve at 79, Danielle. Go do what you have to do. Tell my boy his mother said hello." Danny drove home in the dark. She slept better than she had slept in 10 days. Tuesday came in cold and gray. The commitment letter arrived at 7:30 by a young man in a company car who had driven up from Kabul before daylight. She signed for it. She put it in a manila folder on the front seat of the truck. She put on the one good jacket she owned, a wool blazer her mother had bought her for her 30th birthday that she had almost never worn, and she drove into Willow Springs with the folder on the seat, the ledger in the satchel on the floorboard, and the wrapped wool cap in a paper sack on top of the folder. The courthouse hearing was at 9. She walked into Judge Ellis Hollis's courtroom at 8:50 and took a seat in the front row. Curtis Mercer was already there with Bill Fortner, the two of them at the plaintiff's table whispering over a stack of documents. Curtis looked up when she came in. He did not smile. He looked instead like a man who had put good money on a horse and was watching the horse balk at the gate. Ellis Hollis took the bench at 9 sharp. He was 55 years old, broad in the shoulders, wearing his robe, the way a man wears a robe when he has grown into it, rather than had it hung on him. He had his mother's pale blue eyes and none of her softness. He read the caption of the case. He asked whether plaintiff was ready. Fortner rose and said plaintiff was ready. He asked whether defendant was represented. Danny stood. "I am representing myself, Your Honor." Hollis looked at her a long beat. She could not tell from his face whether he knew who she was. "You understand that in a matter of this weight, self-representation is not usually advised." "I understand that, Your Honor. I would like to proceed anyway." Hollis nodded once. Fortner opened. He walked the court through his theory of the case. He argued that the 1947 probate of the Mercer estate had failed to account for assets held on the property that had come to light only recently as a result of demolition work being performed by the current title holder. He argued that under the exception provided by Missouri Code for undisclosed assets, the estate was subject to review and that his client as a lineal descendant through a collateral branch was entitled to reopening. He did not name the ledger. He did not name the room. He simply said that assets of potential historical and market value had been discovered on the property. He said that in vague enough terms that Danny understood he did not know exactly what she had found. He knew only that she had found something because Harlan Whitcomb had told him so. Hollis heard him out. When Fortner sat down, Hollis turned to her. "Miss Mercer." She stood. Her hands were steady. She had practiced this at the kitchen table until she could deliver it clean. "Your Honor, Mr. Fortner has referred to the discovery of undisclosed assets on my property. I want to address that directly. I did find something in the course of dismantling an outbuilding on my grandfather's land. I have brought it with me today, and I would like to enter it into the record so the court can see for itself what it is. Before I do, I want to say on the record that I met with your mother last night, and I have her permission to enter what I am about to enter." Something moved behind Hollis's face that had not been there a moment before. He held very still. "Approach the bench, Miss Mercer." She walked to the bench. The bailiff took the satchel from her. She had marked the pages she needed with slips of paper. She had folded her grandfather's letter into the front cover so it would open the moment Hollis lifted the leather. Fortner rose. "Your Honor, we have not seen this document. We would ask for a chance to review it before it is entered." "Mr. Fortner, if it is what your own filing has described as the basis of your claim, I am going to look at it now." Hollis lifted the ledger. The letter unfolded across the top page as it opened. He read the letter first. He read it slowly. Danny watched his face. She watched him get to the second paragraph. She watched his jaw set in the way she had watched her father set the day the vet had told him about the calf they were going to lose. Hollis read the whole letter twice. Then he turned to the pages of the book itself. He went through it. He did not go fast. He was on the bench, and he did not have to. Nobody in the room said a word. He stopped at one page. Danny could see from where she stood that it was the page dated February 1941. He held it for a long moment. Then he closed the book. He set the letter on top of it. He looked out at the courtroom. For the record, this court notes a potential conflict of interest, which the court will address before proceeding to any ruling on the merits. The name of the presiding judge's mother appears in the document just entered. The court will inquire whether the parties wish to move for recusal. Fortner shifted in his chair. He looked at Curtis. Curtis's eyes had gone very small. Danny spoke up before Fortner could. "Your Honor, the defense does not move for recusal. I have already discussed the contents of this document with the person mentioned. She has given her express permission for it to be entered and reviewed. I have no objection to Your Honor ruling on the case." Hollis looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Fortner. "Mr. Fortner, does the plaintiff move for recusal?" Fortner opened his mouth. He looked at Curtis. Curtis gave a small, tight shake of the head that Fortner clearly wished he had not seen. Fortner closed his mouth. He sat down. "Plaintiff does not move for recusal, Your Honor." "So noted. Mr. Fortner, are you aware of the contents of this document?" "No, Your Honor, not in detail." "Your client claims a right to reopen an estate based on a document he has never read." "Your Honor, my client understood there to be items of significant value on the property. The specific nature of those items was not known to us at the time of filing." "I see." Hollis's voice went very quiet. "Mr. Mercer, stand up, please." Curtis stood, slowly. "I am going to tell you what is in this book. I am going to tell you because in about 4 minutes I am going to dismiss this claim, and I want to be sure you understand what your name is attached to before I do." Hollis let the sentence sit. "This is a ledger kept by Elias Mercer of this county between 1936 and 1941. It records the distribution of food to families in this valley during the years when the Depression came late here and did not leave when it left the rest of the country. It records the names of the families. It does not record any prices. Elias Mercer gave what he had to whoever came asking. He kept the book so he would remember, and he built a room to keep the record where nobody but him would see it, because he did not want the families in this book ever to be embarrassed by the fact that their names were in it. He wrote a letter that has been under his shelf for 51 years, and I have just read it, and I am not going to read it aloud in this courtroom, because he did not intend it to be read aloud in this courtroom, and I mean to honor that." Curtis was very still. "Mr. Fortner, your filing describes a discovered asset of historical and market value. I want the record to reflect the court's finding that this is neither. It is a private family document of a moral nature. It has no market value. It has no legal weight against the 1947 probate. Its existence provides no grounds for reopening the estate. Your Honor, if I may, we would ask for the opportunity to have the document independently appraised." "Denied. I have looked at it. I am the court in this matter, and I have determined it. Your client's claim is dismissed with prejudice." "Costs to the plaintiff." Hollis lifted the gavel and set it down without striking it. I would say more, Mr. Mercer, but I do not think I would be able to keep my voice out of the record if I did. You are dismissed. Do not appear before this bench again on any matter touching this estate. Curtis stood in place for a beat longer than he should have. Fortner touched his elbow. The two of them turned and left the courtroom without looking at Danny. Curtis's face was the color of raw wood. He had come to town on a plan, and the plan was gone. Danny gathered the satchel from the bag. Hollis met her eyes for a long moment before he called the next case. He did not smile. He gave her a small nod that was not for the record, and she gave him one in return, and then he went on. As she turned to leave, she saw his hand rest for a beat on the closed cover of the ledger before he slid it across the desk toward the clerk. She thought he might drive out to Turner Creek that afternoon. She thought Marlene would be ready for him when he came. She walked out of the courthouse at 9:40. The bank auction was at 11. She had not eaten breakfast. She had not eaten supper the night before either. She walked across the square to the diner, and she sat at the counter, and she ordered black coffee and a piece of dry toast, and she ate it slowly while she watched the hands of the clock over the register move toward 10:30. The manila folder from First Ozark Savings sat on the counter beside her plate. She had not taken her hand off it since she had walked in. The paper sack with the wool cap was on the stool beside her. At 10:40, she paid her check. She walked across the square to Ozark County Trust. She went in through the front doors past the same brass rail her father had leaned on for 30 years signing operating notes. Harlan Whitcomb was at the far end of the lobby in a small conference room whose glass wall faced out onto the floor. Two men were with him. One of them was in a dark suit and looked to Danny like he had come up from Springfield. The other one was Sheriff's Deputy Loomis in uniform, whose presence at a foreclosure auction was standard procedure and who had known Danny's father for 20 years. The auction had been set to happen on the courthouse steps at 11. She was not going to let it get that far. She walked to the conference room. She opened the door without knocking. Whitcomb looked up. She saw the moment when he saw her face and understood something had shifted in the last hour. She saw him recover. "Danielle, I was going to come find you. You do not need to." She set the manila folder on the table in front of him. She opened it. She slid the commitment letter from First Ozark Savings across the polished wood until it stopped in front of his hand. The balance owed on the note. Wire transfer scheduled for 11 o'clock this morning. Confirmation will be in your telex machine before you would have called the first bid on my land. Whitcomb looked at the letter. He did not touch it. His mouth did not move for a long moment. She watched him read it once and then read it again, and then look up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "I see him. You have the option under the loan agreement to accept full payment. You do not have the option to refuse it. I am aware of that." Danny did not sit down. She reached into the paper sack. She took out the folded cloth. She set it on the table beside the commitment letter. She unwrapped it slowly. The wool cap sat on the polished wood between them. The logo showed clear under the conference room lights. "Deputy Loomis, I want to draw your attention to this. This cap was left on my property in my north pasture at approximately 2:15 in the morning, 8 days ago, by one of two men who were cutting my fence with a pair of bolt cutters. The bolt cutters are still in my barn. I fired a warning round from a .22 rifle over the head of the man who dropped this cap. He and his companion ran. A third man was waiting for them in a pickup truck at the edge of the county road with its lights off. The cap has the logo of this bank stitched into the lining. I am not accusing anyone in this room of anything today. I am putting this in the room on this table in front of you and the gentleman from Springfield so that everyone here understands what I know." Deputy Loomis had gone very still. He looked at the cap. He looked at Whitcomb. He looked back at the cap. Whitcomb's face had gone the color of paper. "Danielle, I am sure there is an explanation. I am sure there is too, Mr. Whitcomb. I am going to leave it to Deputy Loomis to decide whether he wants to look for it." Danny gathered the cap back into the cloth. She left it wrapped on the table where they could all see it. "The debt is paid. The land stays. That is all that needs to be said between us." Deputy Loomis stood up. He did not look at Whitcomb. He touched the brim of his hat toward Danny and walked out. The man in the dark suit from Springfield stood as well. He did not say anything. He picked up his briefcase and walked out behind the deputy. Danny stood at the head of the table with her hand still on the edge of the folder. Whitcomb sat there. She watched him think about what to say. She watched him decide twice on things he then thought better of. Danielle, I want you to know that whatever you think happened here, it was not personal. She looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he stopped meeting her eyes. A man who tries to take something from another person and puts nails in her tires when she says no and pays a distant cousin to file a false claim in court to slow her down and sends men to cut her fence in the dark does not get to call it not personal. He gets to call it what it was. She kept her voice level. She kept it low. The debt is paid. The land stays. Goodbye, Mr. Whitcomb. She picked up the folder. She picked up the wrapped cap. She left the conference room. She walked out through the lobby of Ozark County Trust into the noon sun of a Tuesday in March, and she got into her truck and she drove home. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time before she moved. The satchel was on the chair beside her. The ledger was in the satchel. Her grandfather's letter was folded inside the front cover. Everything she had walked into town with, she had walked out with. Everything she had walked into town without, she also had. It was going to take her a while to feel the shape of that. She went out to the smokehouse at 3. She stood in the doorway of the small back room and she looked at the shelves and the crates and the balance scale and the tin of salt, and she felt the room around her differently than she had felt it a week earlier. She was not standing in a discovery. She was standing in an inheritance. There was a difference. She spent the afternoon cleaning. She swept the floor. She wiped the shelves. She stacked the empty jars in one place, the burlap sacks in another, the crates along the back wall as they had been. She did not remove anything. She did not add anything. She set the ledger back on the shelf nearest the door, exactly where she had found it the first day. That evening, she drove out to Earl Whitfield's place with a covered dish in the passenger seat. Not for any occasion. It was chicken and dumplings her mother had taught her to make from a pot she had put on the stove that morning before she had left for court. She had cooked it without thinking about who she would give it to, because she had known before she woke up that she would give it to Earl. Earl came to the door. He looked at her. He looked at the dish. He held the door open. She sat at his kitchen table for the better part of an hour. She did not talk much. She let him talk. Earl told her in the slow way of a man who had held a promise for 46 years about the summer they had built the room. About the way her grandfather had drawn the plans on a piece of butcher paper at this same table. About the trips they had made after dark to the far side of the property for the dark stone. About the winter the following year when the first families had started coming. About the second man her grandfather had trusted with the arrangement, a man named Henry Pletcher who had died in a tractor accident in 1943 and taken the last part of the story with him. Earl did not tell her he was sorry for turning her away on his porch. He did not need to. When she stood up to leave, he walked her to the door. He put his hand on her sleeve for a moment. He looked at her. Your grandfather would have liked that you did not have to sell what he built to save what he left you. Danny did not answer. She did not need to. The spring came on. She planted the seeds, all of them. The families who had signed the partnership agreements came out on weekends and after work in the evenings, and the 2 south fields went into the ground faster than she had hoped, and the corn came up green and even by the second week of May. She built a plain wooden table outside the smokehouse door because it felt right to have one there. She did not put a sign on it. The first jar of green beans somebody left on the table came in late July. She did not know who had left it. She left it sitting there, and by the following morning it was gone, and something else was in its place. A small sack of tomatoes, a jar of pickled okra, a folded flour sack tied around a half-dozen eggs. By September, the table had a rhythm. Neighbors stopped by without stopping in the house. Something arrived most mornings. Something less arrived most evenings. She did not keep a book on it. She did not need to. Her grandfather had already written the book, and it was on the shelf inside, and she meant to leave it there. Marlene Hollis came by in October with a box of empty glass jars, the same kind that had sat on the shelves for 50 years, and left them on the table without a word. 2 weeks later, Ellis Hollis drove up her lane in a black sedan on a Saturday afternoon, walked to the smokehouse door. Alone stood inside the little room for a long, quiet time, and drove back out without stopping at the house. Danny watched him from the kitchen window and did not go out to meet him. Some things a man needed to see by himself. Earl came by one afternoon in the same month, moving slower than he had in March, and stood in the doorway of the little room for a long while. He looked at the jars that had been added to the shelves. He looked at the ledger which had been closed on top of the letter. He looked at Danny. Your grandfather would have liked that you did not put a sign on it. Danny looked at him. She smiled the small smile she had not smiled at anyone else all fall. Did not seem like it needed one. Earl nodded slowly the way a man nods when a thing has finally settled right in his mind after a lifetime of sitting slightly wrong. He did not stay much longer. He walked back to his truck with his cane in one hand and the porch rail in the other, and he drove off with the last of the day's light on his windshield. That evening, after the sun had gone down behind the ridge and the yard had gone blue in the way it went blue in the fall, Danny carried a kerosene lamp out to the smokehouse. She unlocked the little back room. She set the lamp on the shelf where the ledger sat. She took the book down. She turned to the last blank page, the one right after the final entry from 1941, and she uncapped the pen she had brought out with her. She wrote the year in her own hand. 1988. Underneath it on the line below, she wrote one line. The room is open again. She closed the book. She set it back on the shelf. She lifted the lamp. She stepped outside into the cold, clean air of an October evening in the Ozarks, and she pulled the door of the little room shut behind her, and she walked back up the yard toward the house with the light of the lamp swinging beside her leg, and she did not look back.